Welcome back to Church Without Walls. It's been a minute. I'm John, and this is Gringo. No, we have a fish named Gringo after the Beatles, John, Paul, George, and Gringo, right? Folks, we're going to talk about, with Joe Rogan and Matthew McConaughey today, we're going to talk about throwing out the bathwater, which I think you should do. But in context, it's about science and faith and the role of the Bible. That and more right after this. Okay, so, I'm going to jump right into it because, and maybe I'll answer some of the questions that we've been getting online recently as I do this. But I'm going to jump right into it. This was an interview that took place between the actor Matthew McConaughey and the media celebrity. I don't know how to describe him. Joe Rogan. He's a great interviewer. This was from about 2 years ago. And I'm going to just jump right in. Hopefully this will work. And we can discuss, we can interject as it's going and see where we land.
Contact again, and I haven't seen Contact in forever. And first of all, god damn, what a good movie that was.
It's a good movie.
That's a good movie, and a great movie about aliens. Like a movie that it gives you a different perspective on the possibilities of contact, and just the fact that it was a Carl Sagan book, and there's just so much good to it. That character that you played was a fascinating guy, and I kind of feel like there's some of you in that guy.
Sure.
I mean, you are. Am I wrong here? You are religious in some way.
Yeah.
Let's stop here and talk about what they've mentioned so far. So the movie Contact is a wonderful movie. It's based on a Carl Sagan book. I think Matthew McConaughey might be, and I might be saying it wrong. I say McConaughey. I don't know exactly the pronunciation, but that's just what comes out. So if I'm wrong, I apologize, Matthew. But I think he's more known for Interstellar as far as space movies goes, but Contact is way better. But I want to say something first about Contact before we move on, in case you haven't seen it or you haven't read the book. But let's focus on the movie because that's what was mentioned here. There is a moment in Contact, and he does play a believer in Contact, and he's kind of the protagonist, if you will, or the antagonist. I guess he's the antagonist to the character played by Jodie Foster, who is pictured as just the kind of materialist scientist who doesn't really believe in the supernatural, or at least is skeptical of it, and has her reasons to be. And there's a conversation that takes place between these two characters at one point where McConaughey is arguing that science can't answer everything. There are things science isn't meant to answer because it's out of its scope. And to kind of get this across to the Jodie Foster character, he asks her, this character, if she loves her father. And she's got a very close relationship with the father. She loves him dearly, and she said yes, And then he says, can you prove it? Right, I mean, can you use the scientific method to prove your love for your father? And something clicks in her at that point. And I'm bringing up this part of the movie just to show you that whenever Carl Sagan is brought up in many Christian circles, he's mentioned kind of like Richard Dawkins or something like that as an enemy of the state, and you can't observe anything nice about him because he wasn't Bible believing Baptist or something like that, you know. But I wanted to bring this up to show you just the magnanimity of his heart and mind to put that into his movie, to show that he realizes that he's not at root just a materialist in the sense that nothing else is possible. He was agnostic in that point, and I thought it was gracious of him to include this in the movie, this segment that is quite frankly an argument of many theists. So I wanted to point that out to you because it was my favorite part of the movie Contact, one of my favorite parts. And here McConaughey is asked about the particular character. Rogan makes the suggestion that kind of, is he you? Am I wrong to say that from what I've heard about you in other interviews and so forth, you guys have a lot in common? So this is kind of the question, and here McConaughey swings at.
Absolutely. And I want to bring this up in this day and age when people go, no, I'm not religious, I'm only spiritual. You know what the Latin root of religion is? Re-legare. And legare means to bind together. Re means again. Well, in a world that's saying I'm only spiritual because I want unity, that's exactly what religion means. We bastardized the meaning of it over time, and we've excluded people, and we've corporatized it and such. But yes, I am religious. That character, you know, I had written stories. I'd written a college paper called John Wayne Goes West, and it was.
I'm going to stop it here. Probably stopped it a little too late, but we'll come back and do his story here. And his point about the fact that he is religious, not just spiritual, I think this kind of hints at an argument that we've had on the show in the past, or at least a discussion we've had in the show in the past, how religion has become a dirty word, right? As dirty as political. They're both necessary, I would argue, but we live in an age where religion has landed on hard times. The Catholic faith, for example, has had the priest and the bishop scandals and all kinds of mistreatment of indigenous peoples coming out, and the accrual of wealth and the hypocrisy thereby and so forth. And then the evangelical world saw the Catholic world and said, hold my beer. And their scandals have far reached greater levels of indignity even than the Catholic Church, simply and it simply maybe not noticed as much because the Catholics have a pope and a system, and the evangelical church is so broad with all the different denominations and so forth. But as far as sex scandals and misuse of power and of funds and all this, they're dotting all the I's and all the T's as far as scandalous people. And so when people see that, they react the same way as people who recognize that all politicians to some level are corrupt and liars and just fundraisers and trying to push agendas, and they're very far from the way people see the founding fathers and so forth, even though a lot of that might be apocryphal or mythical. And so some people just don't vote, and they don't watch the news. They don't read the news. They just go right to either the business section or the sports section or the comics, or if people still read newspapers. But they've foregone that area because it's ugly and it's corrupt, and they don't want to be defiled by it. So many people will say the same thing about religion. I'm not religious, because they don't want to be in the same team picture as, any one of a number of these abusers that are connected to religion. They don't want to be connected to that. In the way that very many people after the Trump presidency had a hard time saying they're evangelical anymore, because of the evangelicals covering for things that they had condemned in other people, and or even saying I can't be a Republican anymore because this is not what I see as is true conservatism. So they distance themselves from religion, and yet they still would say I'm spiritual because I do believe in the greater things. I do believe in the divine. I do believe in a creator. I do believe that there are things that speak to the better angels of our nature. I do believe that in its best sense, faith and the world of faith can bring the best out of people. And yet when it comes to religion or organized religion or churches or denominations or so forth, I see all the pettiness and I reject it. I see all the smallness. I see all of the flaws. I see all the blindness where people of these certain faiths are blind to their own susceptible fallibility, and yet they're quite clear of the sliver in everyone else's eye. So he's arguing against that right now. He's saying, no, there really is something to being religious. He's arguing for the better part of what it means to be religious. And he's saying, no, we could still retain that word in its best sense. And so I'm not going to argue with him on that. But I just wanted to throw in the other side of the issue. And how do I feel about this? Well, we'll come to my feelings about it a little bit more.
About how can you be a believer in a world of science? And I remember writing things like during the making of that movie, like science is the practical pursuit of God. The two are not exclusive. They dance together. They go together. Belief in science, and I never saw those as contradictions. And that's part of the reason I attacked that role and became a part of that movie. I wanted to play a person that had that point of view of a believer in a world of science, not at the exclusion of science and not at the exclusion of belief.
I'm going to stop him right there and just say, I'm not arguing with Matthew McConaughey. I've brought this clip on the show to show you that there's a lot in it I find is wise and worth at least thinking about. But here again, his argument that science and faith are not contradictory is only half the story. In their best sense, science and faith don't need to be contradictory. But if you look at the history of science and faith, then you can't help but see where their companionship has been less than fertile or less than honorable. And you could go back to where you first start seeing division, and there's been division before this, but in the era of modern science, the church, both Catholic and Protestant, shaking its fist at Copernicus and Galileo and dragging their feet on that, and even making that a spiritual issue, an issue that the Bible spoke to or something, was ridiculous. And you see the same thing happening today. I bring this up because some people are rolling their eyes when Matthew makes the statement that he just made, because they see people who are obstacles to modern science, and they're all people of faith. They see people who are arguing for the flat earth based on their reading of the Bible. They see people who are arguing against climate science or against wearing masks or against taking vaccines. They see people who are arguing against biological evolution in the same way that these people argued against Galileo and Copernicus. It's just the same old arguments. They read a certain verse a certain way, and so what the test tube and the laboratory is telling us can't be true because my Bible or the way I read my Bible says that can't happen. And so it's easy for people to find this disconnect between science and faith, even in our time. And then to hear Matthew McConaughey say, I never saw it, I think it has to be delivered in context. It's out there. It's to be seen. It's clearly seen and relevant. when you have evangelicals being the biggest people who argued against masks and continuing to meet in social settings during the midst of a global pandemic. Other people are going to trot that out and say, what are you talking about? Are you blind? But again, McConaughey is speaking to what should be and what has been in many cases. People of faith have been leaders in different branches of science and continue to be leaders today, as Francis Collins was for the National Institute of Health and so forth, as many others are. And yet there is this stain that really is one direction. It's really people of faith who've become an obstacle for the world of science. It's not the other way around. If your theological views are contradictory to reality, it's not reality that should step out of the way. All right, so I just want to throw that out there. I agree with McConaughey. We've had a show called Voices in the Wilderness where we interview people of faith at the crossroads of faith and science. I'm going to take that in a different direction now, simply because I need to make some changes there. The way we were doing it and the places we were showing it were not as receptive as I once thought to people who aren't believers. And when Wendy and I started Voices in the Wilderness, the whole idea of the ministry was to walk into the far country with those who are walking away from the church, or those who have been hurt by it, or those who are deconstructing, and especially those who have deconverted, and let them know that there's still a seat at the Father's table and they're welcome there. And to be around some people who made atheists the enemy, or who would use arguments, straw man arguments that kind of got into this combative form of Christian versus atheist. I'm not interested in that at all, and I didn't want that to in any way stain the tone of our ministry, and so we've made some changes there. But let's keep going here, because we're getting to the portion that I really want to talk about.
Yeah, it's a confusing role for a lot of people if someone is a believer and also a proponent of science, because they want to know, what are your literal beliefs? Like, are you taking the Bible at its literal word, or do you use it as some sort of a guidebook of the experiences of these people that lived thousands of years ago that have been translated from multiple different languages back to English? And is there wisdom in those translations? Is there wisdom in those original thoughts, these thousands of years of people contemplating and mulling on these things, and that so many have used these as a scaffolding for morals and ethics and for societies?
Yep.
All right. I want to stop there. Rogan had a lot to say there. There's virtually nothing I disagree with him there. And I need to point out that, well, Matthew McConaughey is a believer, Joe Rogan is not. He's been very critical of the Bible. He's been very critical of people of faith because of their misuse of the Bible. And yet I think he's being objective here and fair. I think there are legitimate arguments that people make, like Joe Rogan, for people that have used the Bible in a way to manipulate and to control and to dispossess people of their, not only their wealth, but of their whole identity, and to keep people down and to move people around. There is no argument there. And yet when people of faith hear any criticism of the Bible or people who have misused it, their general reaction to that is to dig in their heels and circle the wagons instead of just admitting that Napoleon was right when he saw how the church can be used as a tool just to move people around. There is truth to that. And it's still happening today. And maybe the greatest con ever pulled is somebody saying to you, "Hey, I've heard from God, and He told me that you should give me money, or He told me that you should vote for my guy, or He told me that you should leave this land because God gave it to me and not you, or He told me that you shouldn't love your neighbor, not because he's your neighbor's wife, but because the sexual laws outlined in this book I have declare that you as an individual don't really exist." There are constant things here where you could point out that the Bible has been misused. Having said that, you can do that about fire. You could say, look how fire has been misused. It's burned. It's been used to burn down the Library of Alexandria. And if you're making the argument that we shouldn't have fire or use fire based on its misuse, I think you come into an area of dichotomous thinking that is not only wrong-headed, it's just not thoughtful. And I think Rogan is open to the fact that, yeah, maybe McConaughey is onto something here. And here he goes.
It's I mean, for people that go, oh, it's a circus book, or people that non-believers, and I'm like, well, it's still the best one going. There's a lot of great truths that come out of the Bible, and it is open for, and a lot of people, it has been interpreted and reinterpreted. It has been translated. It has been handed down. I, for myself, I don't know what to do in my daily life with the burning bush. I don't know what to do with that. I do know what to do with love your neighbor like yourself. I do know what to do with Matthew 6:22. If thy eye be single, thy whole body will be full of light. I do know what to do with some proverbs that I can take into daily practice and go, oh, I felt my life. I felt improvement. I felt success in my relationships, in my relationship with the day, with my career, by following that, by treating others how I wanted to be treated, the golden rule. So I take the practical stuff myself and try to utilize it and pick out what can work for me.
When you
All right, let's stop there for a second and talk about this. I love that answer. Some would say that reminds me of Thomas Jefferson a little bit, who Jefferson looked at the Bible as a place where you could find wisdom, but he didn't take everything out of it, and he'd clip things out that weren't meaningful to him or that he thought were exaggerated. And he's been criticized for that, taking out all the verses that claim deity for Christ or claim miracles. They didn't do anything for him. They were a distraction to him. He wanted his meat and potatoes were the levels of practical truth taught in Jesus's words and ministry. And this is where I want to say to you that if you're going to throw out the bathwater, I'm all for that. There's a lot of bathwater in Christianity. There's a lot of bathwater even in the group of texts that we call the Bible. If you need to start there, that's great. I just don't want you to throw out the whole thing, because there is beauty, and you can start there. McConaughey says, I don't know what to do with the burning bush, this idea that God manifested himself in a flame in a bush that burned but wasn't consumed to speak with Moses. Is that true? Is that just a story? Did it really happen? Was water turned into wine? Did he walk on water? Or even, apart from Christ, did the Exodus really happen in the way we're told in Exodus and these kind of things? I don't know what to do with all that. I'm going to set that to the side because, frankly, it doesn't do anything for my everyday life. Now, there's something that Wendy and I noticed as a pastor for 20 years and pastor's family for even longer. We noticed that there was some people that we'd bump into either in our church or through our ministry that were obsessed with the Bible as kind of like a trivial pursuit. They wanted to argue doctrine. They wanted to collect little anecdotes. And yet they weren't interested in the practical parts of Scripture that McConaughey is talking about. They were really far from loving their neighbor or their enemies, but they wanted to discuss, theology. They wanted to talk about doctrines. They wanted to talk about the minutia that really, and I say really isn't important. For example, when does the church start? In the book of Acts, is it Acts 2? Is it Acts 9? Is it Acts 20? They wanted to argue whether the 12 was in or out of the church, and they'd have long discussions about who wrote Hebrews, or about Paul's ministry being distinct from Peter's, and all this stuff. They'd have long discussions about this, but the love of God wasn't to be found in their heart. They weren't loving people. They hadn't been. Their heartbeat wasn't in sync with that of Christ. If they were on trial for being a Christian, there'd be very little evidence to suggest that they were of Christ. But they knew a lot. They had a lot going on. They had notebooks filled with notes, and yet they never did anything. And this is why they gravitated to certain denominations, because they weren't. It's not only that they weren't required to do anything, but no one really would look askance because, they brought their Bibles on Sundays and Wednesdays, or Sundays and Thursdays, and they took notes, and that was their hat tip to spirituality. And McConaughey is saying, look, all the stuff that people argue about, it's interesting, I guess, on a secondary level, but here's the meat for me. If the eye is single, then the whole body will be light. In other words, train your mind. That's a Stoic idea. Or, love your neighbor as yourself isn't original to Christianity or Christ. That's the golden rule. But Christ goes deeper. Christ doubles down. He says, I tell you not only to love your neighbor, but I tell you to love your enemy and to pray for those who persecute you. That was pretty original. So anyway, McConaughey is saying this, and Rogan doesn't quite understand this. He asked for clarification.
When you say you don't know what to do with the burning bush, what do you mean by that?
I don't know what to do on a daily basis with the teaching of, and then he showed up as a burning bush, or the magic tricks, and I don't know what to do with, and Jesus healed everyone and he couldn't walk, and now he touched him and he can walk. I don't know what to do with that. Mm-hmm. I don't know how to take that into my life and go, there's something useful and practical and healthy for you, Matthew, that you can practice there. So the magic that leans in towards, what we would call now more fantasy, I don't know what to do with that. There's philosophies, there's proverbs, and there's teachings that I think are very valid and very helpful, that we could all be reminded of, that are in the Bible, that I do find quite useful.
Yeah, I think it's almost impossible to figure out what they were trying to say with a lot of the things. That's why it's open to interpretation, but also open to manipulation, and that's where people have a real problem with it, when it's used to separate people, to exclude people, to marginalize people, to judge people. But it's hard for people that understand that those aspects and that those things happen to actually parse out that there's good about it too, and that
Sure.
There's a lot of really valuable lessons in these books.
All right, I'm going to stop there. And I thought that was very big of Joe Rogan to point out. I don't think he was quite there just a few years ago. I think actually maybe it was Jordan Peterson who's brought that out of Joe Rogan. And this is something I'd suggest to my friends who are trying to tell people that they find value in the Bible or in their relationship to Christ. And boy, are those loud. You're looking for the exact one you need, though, so I'm not critiquing you. What is this?
Beetle.
You're doing a beetle? She's wearing a Beatles shirt, and she's coloring a beetle. I'm not sure if let's go there.
I like beetles.
I like Beatles too, but Revolver and the White Album are the kind of Beatles I like. But anyway, back to work. So I think this is large of Rogan to point out that yes, there are people who use these texts to manipulate and injure others and fleece others of their power or their purse, but there is good in these stories. You can find value there. I think he actually learned this from Jordan Peterson. I don't condone everything Jordan Peterson does, but I do think that there are a lot of people who walked away from the Bible and walked away from their background, their spiritual background, because it had grown so disgusting to them that they wanted nothing to do with it. And this is the idea of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I'm not just saying the baby is Jesus. I'm saying the baby is the value that is found, the wisdom that is found, that shouldn't really be burned with the whole Library of Alexandria. Even though there was a couple of crazy volumes in there, or crazy chapters in particular volumes that are just absolute and utter nonsense. So I think there's a whole band of people who've walked away from the faith and want nothing to do with it, and who get triggered when they see a Bible or when they drive by a church even. And I think this area, because of Jordan Peterson, because of Joe Rogan saying this, because of Matthew McConaughey coming out and talking about this, I think they might be closer to appreciating the Bible on a Thomas Jefferson level. And I think that's okay, because I think people have gone to the other extreme. We have two extremes here. We have the extreme to, let's say, the far, I don't know if it's left or right, this is the far end of the room that says the Bible is nonsense, it's rubbish, it's harmful. This is the Christopher Hitchens wing, right? I love Christopher Hitchens, but this was his wing. This was his get-up, that the world would be better off without it. And that's an argument to be made. If you weigh the damage it's done and the good it's done, there's an argument to be made there, and I wouldn't cut off Christopher from that argument. But that is the extreme view, that there's no good in religion, there's no good in faith, it's never done anything good, there's no value in the Bible. And then there's the other extreme end of the spectrum, which says God wrote it. It's God's word, it's divine. And by the way, only our corner of the universe, only our corner of the group, only people who wear clothes the way we do and carry the particular translations that we do and sing the way we do and pray the way we do and pass the plate the way we do and baptize the way we do really knows how to interpret it. God wrote it, but only we know how to speak for him. So actually we wrote it, but so that's the extreme. When you take a collection of texts that we know as the Bible, that were written by men, that were collected by men, that were edited by men, that have been translated by men, and for the most part, I literally mean men, although in modern times you can add men and women. But for the majority of its history, these texts were collected, collated, translated, distributed, and exegeted all by men who said that God wrote it, who said that every jot and tittle, every dotted I and crossed T, every iota is God breathed, is God approved, is God edited, is God condoned, and only we know how to interpret it for you, so you should join our church or buy our series of tapes, or give yourself to this particular denomination and tithe, that kind of thing. These are two extremes that are blown out of proportion and that sacrifice the wisdom of the text, because they're too busy arguing about, is the Bible complete garbage or is it absolutely divine writ, that they never sit down and say, when Jesus said, they don't have the courage of at least Nietzsche to point out that when Jesus says to love your enemies, he critiqued that. Is it, okay, let's talk about that. Is that a weakness? Or in that weakness, is that something that brings out maybe the next evolutionary step for mankind? To realize that as a population, we'd be better if we adopted that view. If we left an eye for an eye in our past and embrace the walking the extra mile, and embrace the turning of the cheek, and embrace the praying for our enemies and the blessing of those who persecute us. Is there an argument to be made there? Let's talk about that. But there's very little talk about that, even in churches and in Christian circles, because of the noise from the two ends of the spectrum. And McConaughey is saying, look, I don't know about all that, but let me tell you what appeals to me. Let me tell you what has changed my life for the better. Let me tell you what has made me a better man, even in hostile or foreign circumstances. Let me tell you what has allowed me to keep my head level in Hollywood. Let me tell you what has helped me with my relationships, personal, public, private. And I'm not telling you, I'm speaking for him now, I'm not telling you that this is the only wisdom in the world. That it could only be found here. Because if you know anything about McConaughey, you know he loves Stoicism as well. So he probably reads the Daily Stoic. He probably reads Aurelius and Epictetus and others. And finds wisdom there too. And yet, he's not willing to throw out the baby with the bathwater, because there's something there. Now, a lot of us know there is something there. When, Romans 13, I'm sorry, not Romans 13, 1 Corinthians 13 has been reduced to just being read at weddings. And there are certain texts that are just read at funerals. And yet these things have become a cliche because there is such wealth there. The think on these things passage in Philippians, the love of Christ passage in Romans 8, these things do take you to higher ground. They do lift you off your feet. You are raptured when you marinate in these thoughts. And not just, by the way, in the New Testament. There are similar passages in the Old Testament, many in the Psalms, many in the Proverbs, many sprinkled throughout the prophets and elsewhere. And yet people want to argue over the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Was that hell or was that purgatory? They want to argue, are the flames real or are they just a metaphor? When Jesus Christ, bringing up that parable, was not making that statement at all. Not at all. He was arguing two main things when he brings up the story of the rich man and Lazarus. If you don't know it, just really quickly, there's a poor man who lives outside a rich man's house. And he's so poor, he's so homeless that the best day, the best moment of his miserable life is when the street dogs come and lick his sores. Because his body's covered in sores. He basically dumpster dives outside the rich man's house because the guy throws away a lot of food scraps and he's able to sustain himself by eating the scraps off this guy's table. Now the rich man dies. And he goes to a place of waiting. It's called Abraham's bosom, or Tartarus, or what have you. And he finds the homeless man has died and is there, and he sees him with Abraham, except the problem is the rich man is on the wrong side of the street. He lived on the right side of the street in real life. In death, he's on the wrong side of the river Styx. There's a great divide that divides these two segments of Tartarus, and there's the favored end, and they're living in bliss, and he sees this homeless man communing with Abraham. And he's really thirsty, and he asks for water, he can't get it. And then he realizes what a dire place he is in, and he begs Abraham to send Lazarus back to his brothers so that his brothers don't end up in the same place, right? So what is Jesus doing here? Jesus is telling a story that underlines the truth of something he's said many times in his itinerant messages, which is this. What favor has a man who gains the whole world but loses his soul. This is the argument he's making with this story. This man had gained the whole world in life in that small end of the rope where the little red tape is, and yet the eternity of life, the rest of the rope, he's going to be in misery because he didn't think on the important things. Right? So what does a man gain by gaining the whole world and losing his soul? This is what Christ is teaching in The Rich Man and Lazarus. And yet when you Google it, when you YouTube it, you know what you get? A bunch of pastors and theologians talking about whether it's hell or purgatory or the flames are real or the flames are metaphors. That's what you get. And the second part of Christ's argument was even if somebody is resurrected and goes back to talk to the brothers, they won't believe him. Even though he's resurrected from the dead, they won't believe him because their doubt is not intellectual doubt. It's volitional. It's emotional. And this new information, even this new revelation, won't move the needle on the Richter scale for these guys because they've hardened their hearts. And frankly, they just won't respect the messenger. And then in a few chapters, Christ raises Lazarus, and this was the moment that the high priest and the Sanhedrin said, oh wow. They weren't in awe that he raised the dead. They were moved to kill him after he raised the dead. So this was Jesus's argument in The Rich Man and Lazarus, that even if somebody was raised from the dead, another Lazarus who was raised from the dead, they won't listen. And did they listen? Did the high priest and the Sanhedrin, who had tormented Christ and followed him and tried to get him to stumble, did they correct themselves? Did they say, oh wow, we've been wrong about this guy, he must be Messiah, let's correct ourselves? No, it infuriated them and it incited them to finally murder Christ. And this is the record you have. And yet no one wants to talk about it. And this is what happens with the Bible. The two extremes get in an argument, and everyone sitting in the middle of the room just covers their ears or walks away, chooses to drink their Starbucks or color their Beatles in another room because of the cacophony coming from the two ends of the room. So basically what I'm saying to you, and I think what McConaughey is saying, and what Rogan is saying, and what Jordan Peterson is saying, is start small. Throw out the bathwater, because it's vile, it's disgusting, it's sick. Why would you keep it? But maybe take your pan and put it in the silt of the river, right? And bring it up and shake it a little bit and see if anything sparkles in the bottom of the pan. That's where you'll truly find those nuggets of wisdom, of encouragement, of inspiration. But you can't find it if you throw the whole thing out as garbage, or if you spend 99% of your time arguing that people should bow to it as if it's the fourth member of the Godhead. I'm done. Poe, are you close?
Yeah, I just have to do one more thing.
Okay. So here's my daughter who went to her 8th grade dance last night. She looked like a beautiful young lady. And yesterday we had this conversation because she drew this tarantula, and it looked real, so it was gross. It was hairy, and it looked real. It was gross. It was disgusting. It was threatening. Tarantulas. It was a threatening tarantula. And then she also drew... It
was friendly. You just don't like tarantulas.
Didn't you draw a beetle, too, yesterday?
I drew a beetle, a tarantula, a scorpion, and a grasshopper yesterday.
No. Here's the thing. I said to her, I hate bugs, but I do like scorpions, and I do like, what do they call it? Praying mantis. I said, draw me a scorpion or praying mantis. And what does she do today? She draws another beetle.
I drew you a scorpion yesterday.
You didn't give it to me.
I'll show it.
I didn't see it. All right, are we done?
Yeah.
Do you need to talk about this?
Let me sign it.
Well, we're back, folks. We were gone for a while, I got to tell you. We were gone for a minute. We're back now. I took a little bit of a sabbatical. Poe took a sabbatical. Go ahead, talk about it.
It's a beetle.
Wow. Okay.
It's a colorful beetle. There's different shades of green and brown in it.
Uh-huh.
And it's in the grass.
Could you draw a
Covered in
boot, like
vines.
right above it, like about to stomp on it, and then I'd like it?
Nah,
No?
I like it. I
Okay.
like beetles.
How about like a bratty kid with a magnifying glass, like standing over it? You know, that's the way some people picture God. There are some communities that make God be out that spoiled brat kid with the magnifying glass, like pulling the wings off of flies and burning ants. Not our God. Not a God worthy of worship. All right, folks, thanks. Yes, we were off for a while. We took a period of time to reflect, right? It was the second anniversary of losing Carter, and we decided to take a month off and just reflect on things.
Beetle.
The Beatles. See you next week, folks. Thanks for stopping by.